Okay, and this little dot should be pulsating, but it's so tiny. Here we go. All right, I think that now officially it's recording. So I always like to begin with a small prayer, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your many blessings, and especially we thank you very much today for the gift of life and health and being together after the storm, the hurricane, major hurricane that came through Florida, and the fact that the eye of the hurricane did not come through the East Coast. But we do pray, dear Lord, for the people of the Caribbean and the people of the West Coast of Florida and further in, who got the brunt of the storm, for the victims, for their family and friends, and for all those who are trying to recover now. We continue to pray also for those who were affected by the previous storm, Harvey, in the West Coast, in the Gulf Coast, particularly Texas, Louisiana, and elsewhere. And for all your people, Lord, especially those who are in most need of your divine mercy at this time. We ask you to bless this program, to bless this course and our lecture today, that we may go deeply into the mystery of the nature that you have created for us to enjoy and to cherish and to care for, including our own human nature, as we seek to do a Judeo-Christian anthropology, a deep vision of the human person, so that we may promote sanctity and the dignity of human life and all life here on earth. As always, we ask your blessings for all your people, especially those who are in most need at this time. And we ask this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, I have some homework to give you back. Let's see. We'll go over the notes in a minute. Normally what I do on the homework is that what is circled is key concepts that I considered, all right? And then what I write is what I considered that was missing. Okay. So we'll go over these, and everyone will go into my style. And I also gave you an example of chapters 1 and 2 here. So before we get into the actual homework, let me just do a little review of last lecture, which this course is on fundamental principles in Catholic bioethics. And our main goal is to establish a Judeo-Christian anthropology, right? We'll use a lot of Greek and Latin derivatives in this course. These are key words because many modern languages come from Greek and Latin, as you know. Logos is study, right? Word, logos, the word, but the word is also the verb and also the study. So study of, anthropos is a reference to the human. So study of the human from a Judeo-Christian perspective, which basically means not only the Old Testament as the ancient covenant of the Hebrew people, the first that we know of in our history, who are monotheistic, they believe in one God, right? But also continuing into the new, what we consider the new and eternal covenant in the blood of the Lamb with our Lord Jesus. In other words, the one God becomes incarnate and reveals that mysteriously this one God is three divine persons. So the central mystery of our faith being the Trinity. So I consider this to be truly a deep anthropology. All right, Judeo-Christian is respectful both of our Christianity, but also which with our Christianity we include what? We include Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, which are the three main, if you will, branches of Christianity today. But also our elder brothers and sisters, as we say in the faith, the Jewish people. So certainly the 73 books of the Bible, 46 of the Old Testament, 27 of the New, but also considering tradition and that God reveals himself to us gradually in steps. And the final manifestation of revelation is when he becomes one of us. He can get much closer to us than becoming one of us, right? What more can he do? And that's what we call the incarnation in Christianity. Now, also, we're going to go phylogenetically and ontogenetically, right? Genetically meaning Genesis, meaning the origin of. Onto is being, onto. So the origin of each one of us individually, right? Which we're going to trace. We can trace that to a particular time and place, down to the minute and to the second, and in a particular geographical region of Earth. Namely, when our mothers were conceived, were impregnated by our father's sperm, all right? And that has a specific time and place on this earth, on this history, and that would be our origin. But that part will be saved for a course that we'll take next semester, which is the bioethical issues at the beginning of human life, right? So when we look at bioethical issues toward the beginning of human life, what is the big bioethical issues at the beginning of human life that you can think of?
Conception.
The A word, abortion, right? That's a big one. But also contraception, and also in vitro fertilization, and also three-parent embryos, and genetic engineering of the genome, embryo experimentation, etc., etc. So you see that the issues become expanded and expanded, right? If we establish when human life begins, biologically, physiologically, factually, independent of whether we want it or not, who of us has to be created? None, right? And yet here we are. So I always try to establish the basic biological, physical fact, and then we build on that. So this ontogenetically is a reference to our origin individually, each one of us, and every human being of the same species, reference to the next course, right, in the spring. So in this course, we're going to concentrate phylogenetically. So again, genetically origin, and phylum is the group. So as a species, when did we begin as a species? In other words, Homo sapiens, and if you want to be more specific, Homo sapiens sapiens. When did we begin? Because we also have the fossil record of other hominins who have been around, who are extinct today. And we are the only species of the genus Homo. Moving forward then, I just don't really want to repeat the first lecture, but we'll get, and then that's the integration from science and faith, so that there will be a complementarity there. My hope is that you will see a very rich complementarity between the biological evidence, the physical evidence, and our beliefs, so that we don't do violence to either one. And this is where I think that Meyer limps a little bit on the religious side or the faith or belief side, right? And I'll talk more about that today, with especially on the homework part. So I'll be combining the science of phylogenetics, specifically the human, with our faith belief, which has these two pillars of sacred scripture and tradition with a capital T. In other words, all the development of theology that has happened over the thousands of years of established religion, institutional religion. Darwin's definition of evolution, descent with modification. So how does one species eventually become another species? The four main forces that act on evolution. And again, we'll be going over these so they become familiar with them, how they interact with one another. Mutation and recombination, which is at the molecular level, at the DNA level. Migration, also known as gene flow, which is at the level of the population of a particular species, right? The population can be small, like 2 or 3 individuals, or large, thousands of individuals. Drift, which is a random event, and we'll get more into detail about that. But ultimately, natural selection. Natural selection is really the overarching force that may cause evolution, all right? The definition of species, I'm using the biological definition of species, which Mayer was the main contributor to that concept, right? Defining a species by 2 characteristics that any 2 individuals of that species can interbreed successfully, right? So not just copulate, but to actually interbreed successfully, which means that their offspring are also fertile, capable of reproducing. Whether that offspring actually reproduces or not is another issue, which has a lot to do with chance and everything else. But at least that the offspring should be fertile, right? So that is the biological definition of a species. Mayer was the main contributor to that last century because, believe it or not, scientists were not in agreement or in accord with what defines a species. If we're talking about descent with modification, in other words, moving from one species eventually becoming another, well, what do you mean by species, right? It has to be, for science, it has to be very well delimited. That I'm talking about a red fox and not a gray fox, because they could be varieties of the same species as opposed to different species. So if they're able to, if the gray fox and the red fox are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they're just varieties of the same species. But if they're not, if they're able to interbreed, if they're able to mate, but their offspring is infertile, is sterile, then they can be considered 2 different species and not just a variety, a gray and a red variety of the same species, right? Humans, we all belong to the same species, even though we have variety in height and weight and color of eyes and color of hair and color of skin and many other characteristics that make us variants, but of the same species, okay? While I'm on the topic of species, then quickly, these are key terms that we should be on board, but you teach science and biology, so you're familiar with individuals of the same species make a population in a particular geographical region, and you can have 2 different populations of the same species. But if they're in different geographical regions, then they're 2 different populations, okay? Populations of different species coming together form a community. And then when you add the abiotic factors, what are abiotic factors? Non-biotic factors, non-living factors, like what? Give me examples.
Weather.
Yeah, weather, temperature, soil composition, chemical, physical conditions, right? Then when you add those factors, you start getting more realistic about nature, then that becomes an ecosystem. You put several ecosystems together, you get a biome, which are large regions of the world. There are about 6 biomes, 6 large regions of the world, both on land and in the water also, in the ocean. Okay? And then when you put all the biomes together, there's half dozen biomes, more or less, you get the biosphere. In other words, the Earth from the living perspective. Let's skip a little bit. I already talked about the modern synthesis and Mendel and Darwin. These are key figures in the first half of the 20th century, who were also involved in that synthesis. Fisher is best known, but also Haldane and Wright. They all had an influence. They influenced each other with Meyer also. Now, again, briefly, we use a Linnean classification, Carolus Linnaeus, from the 18th century, 1700s. And this is the classification from the smallest going up. Two or more species form a genus, and two or more genera form a family. Two or more families form an order, so on, class, phylum, kingdom, and finally, domain, the three main domains. So here's an example. We start with three main domains, which are going to be eukarya. Eukarya meaning that they have a true nucleus. Karyos, nucleus in Greek, true, right? And for the sake of completion, the other two domains are bacteria and archaea, which are prokarya. They don't have a membrane nucleus. Then there are about 6 kingdoms. We'll go over those in a minute. And then about 3 dozen phyla, classes, many classes, etc. So here's an example of the scientific classification of the American bear, the American black bear, of which there is also a brown variety. Good morning, you're early at 10:15, 10:30. Welcome, Gloria Espinosa. Welcome.
I was working.
Yes, wow, tremendous. Welcome. Take a load off your feet.
Yeah.
Gloria works UM with the supervising the whole vegetation of UM. So, and she has broken ligaments on her leg, on her knee. So double hardship. Here's an example of the American black bear. The species is Ursus americanus. At the genus level is Ursus, okay? So remember the genus includes, the species includes the genus also. Then belongs to the Ursidae, together with other bears like the grizzly and the panda, etc. Carnivores at the level of order, at the level of class, Mammalia. So already at the level of class, we share the same class. We humans share the same class as the bear, because we're also mammals. Okay? And we share everything else, of course. We are chordates. We have a spinal cord, and we're animals, and we have membrane nuclei in our cells. That is the modern classification, and animals are this little spot over here. So this is a phylogenetic tree looking at the molecular evidence of homology, which is much more complete and complex. But the interesting thing about this, it shows the 3 main domains, the eukaryotes, right? Eukaryotes, the archaea, which are primitive bacteria-like, but more primitive than them, and the actual bacteria. And what's interesting is the root system here, that they would have to be. This postulates a common ancestor for all living organisms at the organic level. Right? So if we go down the tree to the root, we come to a single living organism, very, very primitive. But if we go up the tree, out to the branches, we get the estimated 10 to 20 million species that are estimated today, of which about 2 million have been classified, right? So these are the 5 kingdoms here. It's a simpler map, and some of the breakdown according to the nuclei and so forth. I'm going to get more into the evidence for evolution, the fossil record, comparative embryology. Phylogenetics is precisely looking at the percentage of similarity between the DNA of different species and the proteins of different species. Okay? Percentage similarity, the higher the percentage similarity, the closer those species are to one another. The universality of the genetic code also points to a common origin, biochemically speaking, molecularly speaking. And even a contemporary example is that we're actually watching evolution in the make when we see bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. What they call the superbacteria. And tragically, these tend to get trapped in the air conditioning system of hospitals. And that's why today, if you have heart surgery, they try to get you out the door in 24 to 48 hours. Because you have more risk inside the hospital post-operation than in your own home. At least it's not their not their liability once you're out of the hospital. All right. So let's review. Probably overdid it since you have the lecture also. Anyway. Let me see now. I want to look at the homework, okay? So get right to Meyer 1 and 2. So here's an example of how a summary could go, right? For chapter 1 of Meyer, what I'm looking for again is that you understand the key concepts, and I don't expect luxury of detail or even full paragraphs or sentences. You can give me phrases or key points. Okay. Did everyone get the handout? No? See? Welcome. Someone else has it? Yes? So it's interesting because Meyer also got into the philosophy of biology, so philosophy of science. And unfortunately, from my opinion, is that he's also, like all of us, we're products of our own time, right? And even though he did quite a bit of thinking out of the box, on the religion side, since his training was mostly scientific, in my opinion, he discards a little too soon, certainly religion, but also theology and even philosophy, in the sense that he's considering religion to be fundamentalism. In other words, he's considering that religion is essentially literal interpretation of the Bible, which that is fundamentalism. And so when he talks about essentialism and all these concepts, creationism, for example, well, that's a fundamentalistic interpretation of the Bible. We as Catholics take an exception to that, so we're not fundamentalists, with all due respect to other Protestant denominations. So we don't interpret the Bible literally, rather we look for the deeper sense, which is called sensus plenior, and we'll get deeper into that in the second half of the course, all right? But just to set the background, this is where I think that Meyer, with all due respect, limps, in that he's not a theologian, he doesn't really have a formal theological background, and even philosophy, I think he was pretty much a self-made philosopher. But what he was lacking was systematics, and especially in biblical studies, to not consider the Bible, to not take the Bible literally, especially in the narratives of creation. And more specifically, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, right? There are other parts of the Bible, I'll tell you, that the literal text coincides with the sensus plenior. In other words, when Jesus said at the Last Supper, "This is my body," referring to the unleavened bread, "take and eat," we take that literally because it means, but it's not a fundamentalist interpretation. See what I'm saying? What I'm saying is that that phrase coincides with the deeper sense of the passage, right? And that's why we take it literally, that this is truly literally the body of Christ, okay? Because it coincides with a deeper interpretation, but not the other way around. Whereas Genesis 1 and 2, we don't take literally because the literal phrasing does not coincide with the deeper sense of the passage. We'll get more into that, all right, throughout the whole course, but basically that's where I think that Meyer faulted, and that's why he discards essentially creationism and essentialism, because he is considering a literal interpretation of the Bible, sacred scripture, and only the Bible also, which we don't, we are a two-pillar faith. Sacred scripture, the Bible, is one pillar, but the other pillar is tradition, meaning the writings of the theologians and the magisterium, the teaching of the church over 2,000 years. Because there are many issues going on today that are not in the Bible. For example, nuclear warfare is not in the Bible, but the church has a definite position with regards to nuclear warfare, okay? And that's part of the magisterium, the teaching of the church, which is as strong and valid and solid as the Bible because we consider the inspiration of the Holy Spirit in the magisterium. And frankly, there's none of that in Meyer's analysis and discarding of the religious view of evolution, right? To the point that today, like I'm saying, is very compatible. They complement, the science and the faith complement each other with regards to this process of evolution, including our own human creation and evolution. So his analysis of the worldviews of three possible is kind of simplistic at the end of the day, right? Kind of simplistic. But what is most important here is what is happening in Europe around the 1600s with, after the Renaissance and the Baroque period, with the scientific side with the Copernican revolution, all right? So Nicholas Copernicus, in the, he spanned 15th and 16th century, essentially making the shift between the geocentric to the heliocentric theory of the universe, which is still simplistic in today's terms, but let's look at that difference. Geocentric was the standard model, if you will, of the worldview. The worldview meaning a conception of the universe. Why geocentric? In other words, anchored on Earth, like the whole universe rotated around the Earth. And that was interpreted again in a literal sense, in a fundamentalistic way. Why the Earth? Why should the universe rotate around the Earth?
Because that's all they knew. They didn't know anything else except what was right there in front of them that they could touch and see. Right?
Yeah, and even to consolidate that even further, wake up in the morning and there's sun, and then the sun goes in a semicircle to the other end. Certainly the sun is going around the Earth, isn't it? Right, on the side that we can see, and then it's doing the same on the other side that we can't see, but in 24 hours, the sun is back up again at the same place. And the stars are doing the same. If you sit there long enough, you'll actually see the stars go across the sky, the celestial sky, all right? So that was very evident, but it was even more because it was also a very religious view, all right? And Christianity was predominant, at least in the Northwestern Hemisphere, well, the North, not here in the Americas yet, because of the native cultures. But Christianity was certainly prevalent, and with all due respect, in Europe was, the big thinking was happening in Europe during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Baroque, all right? Including the scientific thinking. So, and that was the age of Christendom, right? The incarnate God. In other words, when God decided to become, to manifest fully himself to us, he became one of us, the human. So the human had to be at the center. And the human, literally, in the singular was who? Jesus Christ. And so everything had to rotate around Jesus Christ. It was about Christ. It was about the incarnation, the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. You know, what we call the canonic passage. We'll get more into that. But basically, it was about the incarnate God. And because the incarnate God incarnated on this earth, on this geos, then everything had to rotate around the earth. But it was interpreted, again, in a literal way, okay? In a fundamentalistic way. So the rest of the universe, what was known at that time, literally rotated around the earth. And that's why the prevailing model, the worldview, was geocentric, all right? It was about the human, but even more about the human, Jesus Christ. These thinkers, these philosophers and scientists and mathematicians and astronomers started thinking a little outside the box, kind of bracketing religion for a moment. What if there's another reality here, right? What if we allow the facts to talk to us, to speak to us? Copernicus realized that physically, it was not the sun that was rotating around the earth, but quite the opposite. That it was the earth was actually rotating around the sun. Because he was not looking at a day, but he was looking at a year. Okay? He was not looking at rotation, he was looking at translation, which is the rotation of the earth around the sun. And so that starts people, especially the scientists, thinking in a different perspective, and that's called the heliocentric. Helio, the reference to the sun, specifically helium, which was then, that's why that element is called helium, because it's a reference to the sun. Okay? So that is a shift which is already beginning to discredit religion from the scientific perspective. In other words, that religion was becoming inadequate to explain physical phenomena. And seemed to be in contradiction. Right? And that's why then you keep advancing that kind of thought, and for the next 2 to 3 centuries, scientists take more and more exception of religion because it's not adequate to explain the physical reality that we're seeing. Because the explanation that was coming out was a very theological explanation, but also an incomplete explanation because it lacked precisely the scientific data. So the famous trial of Galileo, all right, the young canonical lawyer who got Galileo into trouble and condemned, all right, was Robert Bellarmine, Saint Robert Bellarmine. But he was accusing Galileo of heresy because Galileo was promoting a heliocentric view of the universe, whereas Bellarmine was saying, no, Jesus Christ has to be at the center. It has to be geocentric. So you see, there was incomplete information on both sides. And both sides were jumping to conclusions to exclude each other. Now, 4 centuries later, we're trying to see the fuller picture, how these 2 different fields of science and theology complement each other. Continuing on the scientific side, then Lamarck made a good contribution because he looked at the similarities between species, and he developed this scala natura, all right, scala naturae, where all species were put on this hypothetical ladder, but it was static. There was no change from one rung to the other of the ladder. So that every species, every animal, every plant that was visible had its own place in nature, but it was static, all right? Did not flow from one to the other. And then he came up with his own Lamarckian theory of evolution within the lifespan of the individual. The famous example is the stretching of the giraffe's neck to reach the higher leaves, which we know doesn't occur. It could stretch the neck of that individual giraffe, but that is not passed on because either the egg or the sperm of that giraffe were formed before she or he stretched out its neck. Okay, so it doesn't get passed on. Mm-hmm. But then again, eventually Darwin does come onto the picture, and with his insights and observation, he makes his contribution of the anagenesis and the cladogenesis, all right? So anagenesis meaning a change from one rung to the other, in other words, speciation, that one species can become another species eventually, but it's still on a single line. And that's anagenesis, from one to the next species. Cladogenesis then is branching out, branching laterally, simultaneously, and these two together is what gives us a fuller picture of evolution. And again, Darwin is able to come with those explanations without any supernatural powers intervening magically, I would say, all right, by what was known back then as spontaneous generation. In other words, and then the classical example was here is rotten meat, and that meat spontaneously is transforming into flies. The actual meat physically transforms into flies. Well, that was called spontaneous generation. And of course, those flies were alive, whereas the meat was not alive. Therefore, it required an act of God because God is the author of life, right? But that today we would call magic, which is not what God is about. God is mystery, but not magic. So that magical way of generating life was discarded by scientists. Today, we would discard that too. But back then, that was considered religious beliefs. Questions or comments about chapter 1? Okay. See the flow? Let's look at chapter 2 from the back side. Now this one I didn't have time to elaborate too much on, but I already spoke about the heliocentric and geocentric mutual exclusion there and what was faulting. In fact, and I mentioned that even the heliocentric, we can consider heliocentric as a transition, but would we say heliocentric today? Heliocentric applies only to what? To what we know as the solar system, our solar system, right? The planets of our solar system. But we know that there are other solar systems out there, even in our own galaxy, which is known as what? The Milky Way, right? Milky Way is the galaxy where we're embedded, and there are millions of solar systems in the Milky Way, which is our galaxy. And there are millions of galaxies in the universe. So certainly geocentric is inadequate, but also heliocentric is only adequate for our solar system, but inadequate for a fuller explanation, a fuller worldview, or a fuller picture of the universe, right? All right. Further down into the chapter then, these are the main evidence for evolution. And again, we're going to be getting into these more deeply. The fossil record, the morphological similarity of individual species, comparative embryology, in other words, the embryonic development of different species is similar, the embryonic development. What is known as vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures that had a function before in another species, but now in current species, they don't have a function, or they have a different function or a minimal function, not the original function. The classical example there is the appendix for us, which is real but non-functional or almost non-functional. But it was very functional in some ancestor as another bag of the digestive system. Mostly were some ancestor that was a herbivore that had to ruminate on trees on vegetation for quite a while. Biogeography, in other words, regionality, geographic regionality of the species, and dispersal from foci, from focal areas into others. And then the molecular evidence, which is mostly the contribution of the second half of the 20th century and big time into the 21st century, the molecular evidence. And that's when we get into the phylogenetic trees and things like that, all right? So it's when we get down to the molecular evidence, it's a much more complex and fuller picture that we're getting of speciation. So a summary like this, you would probably put like a little phrase or sentence in each one of these points. Okay, this would be a little incomplete, but this would be like a skeleton, which if you look at the book, at the chapter, it actually follows the titles and the subtitles of that chapter. All right, so again, just giving you hints on how to do that, that summary so that it's the easiest for you. But also, I'm going to be now combining the chapters with the lecture, so it'll come down to a single summary, all right? A single summary, yeah. Any questions on this? No? Okay, a little bit about the fossil record then. What we have is, first of all, we have to accept the facts. Some fossils are showing up. What's a fossil? Physically, materially. Typically, it's a mineralized bone. It's some part of an animal or a plant that has mineralized and become like a stone, a mineral, like a rock, okay? But it's from a living thing as opposed to a rock from coming out of a volcano, all right? That is not organic, has no organic origin. That's one type of fossil. Let's say a mineralized bone. But plants don't have bones, right? But we do have fossil plants. And we have fossil invertebrates which don't have bones either. So what's another type of fossil? Yes?
One that is buried under sediment and makes an imprint of the organism.
Exactly. You can have the impression, the imprint of a leaf or something like that, and even a footprint. That's also a fossil, okay? Because it can be dated, it can be measured, it can be estimated what creature made that fossil, that imprint. And sometimes even just the casing of the animal, like it occurs especially in crustaceans, arthropods, insects, and crabs and stuff like that. They don't really have bone, but they have this shell that is a protein shell that can also be mineralized or sediment accumulating inside and leave a pretty intact fossil. I was up in, where was it? In DC at the Museum of Natural History, and they had some impressive fossils of arthropods. They were primitive trilobites and primitive ancestors to crabs and lobsters and things like that. And he was down to the antennae. It was just like the whole shell of the animal, but made out of sediment, gray sediment, right? Fine sediment. And I can only imagine the hours of work, maybe the weeks of work that it took for some paleoanthropologists to bring that fossil out of the where it was contained, the sediment block, probably with very fine grinding tools and little drills to shave off the non-animal part. But he had little antennae, little feet, everything almost microscopically. It was amazing. The whole thing intact like that, but a fossil. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so we cannot deny the evidence that there were other creatures that were living before and not today, right? So how did those come about, and where did they go? What happened to them, and how did they come about? why they're not here today, and so forth. So that is pointing toward a common ancestry. Oh, and the fact that those fossils look very similar to some of the creatures living today, but not exact, not identical. So they're not the same species. Radioactive clock, meaning this is at the molecular level, that molecules decay, especially when they have radioactive isotopes, like carbon. The normal isotope of carbon is 12, right? But there's carbon-13 and carbon-14, which are unstable, radioactive, and they decay. And when they decay, they have what is called a half-life, meaning what is the half-life of any element, right? The element, the half-life is the time that it takes for half of that material to decay down to the lower level isotope, from 14 to 13, from carbon 14 to 13, for example, all right? It will take extra, in the case of carbon, it's in the thousands of years. So it's a very good scale for dating organic material. All right, it's a very good scale. So it's the time that it takes, the actual time in years, in some decays very fast. It's in a matter of minutes, other decays a matter of hours, other is a matter of months or years, and some matter of decades, centuries, millennia, and so forth, depending on the element. So that is the radioactive clock is used for dating organic material as far back as we can go. The similarities that occur between species is also pointing towards some common ancestor. It makes sense that if zebras and horses look alike, more or less, they certainly look more alike than zebras and chimpanzees, right? So zebras and horses look alike. It makes sense that they have some common ancestor. Whereas chimpanzees and orangutans look alike, more alike than the zebras and the horses. So it makes common sense that they have their own common ancestor. So by grouping, it's just a similarity, the morphological, the external morphological similarities. Then when we get into the hidden, the embryonic stage, which is going to be hidden from plain sight at the mammalian stage in mammals, right? Because it's within the womb of whatever female mammal that is. Or in the case of reptiles, birds, fish, it's going to be, well, at least reptiles and birds, it's going to be within an egg. So again, it's hidden to plain sight, but we can observe it with some patience. And even in a fish, which that is visible because it's external fertilization, we see that there is common embryonic development. The early stages of embryonic development look alike of different species. So that is also pointing toward common ancestry there, and that is what is called comparative embryology. In other words, comparing the embryonic development of different species and how similar they look. And in general, the further back we go, the earlier the stage, the more common they look, the more common they look in general. From species that eventually are very diverse, like for example, humans and fish. If you go back to the first week of embryonic development, the first days of embryonic development, is practically indistinguishable, a human embryo from a fish embryo, other than the size maybe. Because it's going to look like a zygote, it's going to look like a morula, it's going to look like a blastocyst. At the blastocyst level, you already get a difference because they have blastocysts, they have blastula, all right? But already that's at the third embryonic stage. Morula and zygote are essentially indistinguishable except for the size. But certainly an adult fish is very different from an adult human, right? So that's what is meant by comparative embryology. If we go back, ontogeny is, again, the origin of the individual, all right? And also the origin of the group. Certainly all fish have a very similar embryonic development, but a guppy looks very different from a swordfish. Yeah? And a shark looks very different from a goldfish, but embryonically, they're very, very similar. I already mentioned vestigial structures. Biogeography will get more into that when we look at flow and drift. The molecular evidence, again, we'll get more into this in detail later on. That's basically those chapters. Now, I would get into today's lecture and also chapter 3 of Meyer. Any question? Morning, Marina. Welcome, welcome. Take a seat for a moment. The other students, sit down for a few moments. Sit down. I'm wrapping it up for this first section here. All right. Any questions or comments so far? John, please. You get it.
The ontogeny and phylogeny, they said they kind of follow each other, right? Isn't that okay?
Yes, and that what was called, thanks, that's what has been called this recapitulation. And when I was studying biology in the 60s and 70s, I did high school in Mexico City, and then I did biology here, my bachelor in biology first, Miami-Dade College when I was a junior college, and then FIU when it started in the 70s. This dictum of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny was still around, all right? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What is recapitulation? Is that it kind of repeats. It's a repeat of, right? Recapitulation, it's a repeat of. So ontogeny is the origin of the individual. In this case, the individual species, all right? Whereas phylogeny is the origin of the group as a whole. And it's saying that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny in the sense that it was thought, so this comparative embryology also has its limits. But at first it was seen too expansive. That was trying to explain too much, and it was overreaching. Basically, it was saying that since the human embryo, let's say in the first week of development, looks very similar to the fish embryo in its first week of development, then we are actually fish in the first week because the fish is more primitive. So we go through a fish stage, and then we go through a reptilian stage, and then we go through a mammalian stage. That was because the ontogeny, in other words, the origin of the individual, in this case, the individual species human, is recapitulating the phylogeny. In other words, the origin of all the chordates, of all the vertebrates, which are, what are the vertebrates? Fish, reptilian, bird, mammal, and amphibian, right? Those are the 5. And certainly a fish looks, the adult, now let's think of adults. The adult fish looks very similar, very different from an adult frog, amphibian, which looks very different from a blue jay, which looks very different from a snake, and looks very different from another mammal, dog, all right, adults. But the embryos in the first stage of the first week of development look very similar. But if we rank them from more primitive to more advanced, which is more, let's say, which is more primitive, a fish or an amphibian?
Oh, no, fish.
Primitive, fish, right? In fact, amphibian, typically the larval stage or the juvenile is aquatic, and then it goes on land, but the fish stays aquatic. So between amphibian and fish, the fish is more primitive, right? Or ancestral. Then between amphibian, now we go on land, amphibian and reptile, which is more advanced, you think, and more advanced. A frog or a lizard, which can survive better, for example, generally, can tolerate more changes in climate. The reptile, it's got scales. The amphibian without a moist environment will dry out, has no scales, right? So now we got fish, amphibian, reptile. Now between a reptile and a bird, it's known now that basically the birds evolved from the reptiles, and sometimes they're even classified on the reptile, but this is a flying reptile. So whereas the lizard is stuck to the ground, this bird now can take off, avoiding danger, right? And so which is more advanced? The bird is more advanced than the reptile, right? So we're putting a progression here between the bird and the mammal. You would think that bird may be because it can fly. Some mammals do fly, or at least they glide. But the mammal is going to be more advanced. And the key factor will be a four-chamber heart when you start looking internally. It's a much more sophisticated system, the mammal, more complex than the bird, okay? At any rate, the embryonic development of all these 5 branches is very similar, at least the first week. So this concept, this erroneous concept of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, was saying that for the mammal zebra, at the embryonic stage, the first week was actually a fish. It was indistinguishable between the fish and the mammal, so it was the same. We could say that an embryonic zebra in the first week of development was a fish, but then it developed into the next stage, which would be amphibian, and then reptile, and so forth. We know that's false today, but that was a prevailing concept even as I was studying biology, I tell you, just about 40 or 50 years ago. Okay? So only in a very broad sense can we accept this ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, but not strictly speaking, all right? In other words, each species maintains its own integrity, species integrity from fertilization forward. It's always that species, and there's no, okay, this is another way of looking at it. There is no species saltation or going from one species to the other through the embryonic stage. In other words, we begin as human from fertilization, and we're always human, even though the early embryonic stage is comparable, is very similar, at least morphologically similar, to the other chordates or the other reptiles, the other vertebrates. However, when we go inside the cell, when we look at the DNA, then we're going to find differences, right? There has to be. Okay, anything else? No? So I'm still waiting for a few others. Let's see. Okay. Let me just check here for a moment who else is around. Okay, Gloria. I think that Gloria is coming. The Connect is ready. Waiting for the link. A few others are delayed. Okay, welcome, Gloria. So let me stop here for a moment and catch up on all the other messages that are going on. So I'm going to stop the recording. Yes, I'll start a new recording. That way it won't be too long. I'm going to end this session now.